Hey, what is up? Welcome to this episode of the Entrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast. As always, I'm your host, Brian Lofermento, and this is going to be a fun episode. We've already been having fun off air, talking about sports and travel and all that good stuff, but today's guest is incredible at what he does. He has such a deep understanding and zest for entrepreneurship, for all things business. He's at the cutting edge of branding when it comes to the world of athletes and sports, as well as the intersection of AI. There's so much that we're going to dive into. So let me tell you about today's guest. His name is Nico Ullah. He's the co-founder of Numinal, which is an LA-based marketing agency on a mission to help professional athletes and brands align their values with their media and brand strategy. Lessons that we're really going to see behind the scenes of here today, and we're all going to be able to glean some knowledge for ourselves. Before co-founding Numinal, Nico worked for multiple brands that were involved in sponsorship strategies and discovered that there is a big opportunity to optimize these partnerships by making them more data-driven and using AI models. Nico is currently not working with pro soccer players or brands, but he has two sons aged 7 and 11 who are asking him every day when that will be the case. And now I'm asking him the same question as well. So I'm excited about this one. I'm not going to say anything else. Let's dive straight into my interview with Nico Ullah. All right, Nico, I am so excited that you're here. Welcome to the Entrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast.
Thank you, Brian. Excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Heck yeah, I think it's so cool. You're obviously originally from Germany. You're joining us here today from Portugal. You live in sunny Los Angeles, California. Lots of cool things that you're into. So fill in those gaps for listeners. I tease them a little bit about how awesome you are, but give us the short version of your story. How'd you end up doing all these amazing things that you're doing today?
Awesome. Well, thank you. I started my career, working in advertising agencies, and as you said, that was back home in Germany before my first attempt at entrepreneurship, and I think that was in 2008, and I crashed and burned terribly, but it was a great lesson. And then eventually, in 2011, I moved from Germany to the US, Los Angeles to be specific, and I had to reset my career a little bit, and I think that's probably relevant discussing for all the listeners that are, on their journey to entrepreneurship. I worked mostly on the brand side, marketing for brands, and was exposed to partnerships with pro athletes very early on. I found it very interesting. How much money is left on the table. And fast forward to 2021, finally started my agency, and my agency Numinal, and we work with professional athletes and sports brands. And I'll start there.
Yeah, no, I definitely love the overview. Especially for me, it really hits close to home because I got my own entrepreneurial start. When I was 19 years old, I started a soccer blog. So the world of sports really shaped and launched the entirety of my entrepreneurial career. And Nico, I think that really taught me that so many people, when we think of sports, we think of the competition, the results at the end. We see it on TV. We're fans of the sport. But what we don't realize is the business behind it. And Nico, I think that's what makes you so unique is you are at the intersection of so many different parts of that business. You talk about the partnerships and sponsorships, but we're also talking about the athletes themselves and their branding. You're talking about AI. Where do you want to start this conversation? Because the world of business behind sports is fascinating, and most people truly don't understand even all the puzzle pieces that are at play.
Yeah, 100%. I think I would love to start with how the business of sport has evolved. I think it has evolved a lot over the last 5-6 years. A lot of it is data driven now. And that's exactly where we came in, right? We started with Numinal 3 years ago, and we realized that there's this demand for data and data-driven marketing. And we realized that a lot of the big brands are starting to look into, okay, if I'm partnering with an athlete, how much am I getting out of this, right? Like, how much exposure is this athlete getting? How many Google searches are there for his name? How much time is he exposed? How much exposure, TV exposure is he getting? How familiar are people with him? And those are all data points that both the athletes and the brands are starting to look into. And since me and my team, we all have a background in data-driven marketing, we decided, okay, why can't we create a product here, a service that helps both the athletes and also the brands?
Yeah, I love that that's where we're starting, actually, Nico. That's such a wise starting point that you picked. And I think it's because of this, is that when we talk about sports and the business of sports, people think of, the Gatorades of the world. But I think it's so unique that obviously you guys have some world-class athletes within your portfolio, within the realm of golf, for example. And I think about golf and tennis and F1. I'm going to lump the three of those in, because what those three sports do really well, I think, is they understand and they appreciate the value, the marketability of not just sports, but of course the athletes. We look at Roger Federer, one of the top athletes on planet Earth, and he's retired, but companies like Uniqlo, which is a clothing company, how many watch companies, I don't even know the names of these brands that sponsor Roger Federer, they realize that sports not only has global appeal, but it also brings affluent audiences. It also brings a lot of money, but most importantly, it brings a lot of eyeballs. And where there's eyeballs, there's values. Talk to us about the value that sports and athletes can drive, and how Numinal, basically, I think the important thing that you do is you bridge that gap, because where there's value, you need to maximize the value there. Talk to us about why, what is it? What's the magic ingredient behind sports and athletes?
100%. And you brought such a great example with Roger Federer, because he's a retired athlete, but he was a genius at branding himself during his active career. So he's getting all these sponsorships, and that will continue. I think that's not the case for all athletes. Sometimes they're not as active in establishing a brand for themselves during their active careers, and that means they won't be able to have the same opportunities once they retire. But I think to your question, there is this evolution right now for sports brands and also for athletes in understanding, okay, there's real data. We can really measure the exposure that athletes can bring. That's, as you said, they're part of a culture, right? So there's massive exposure that brands can gain through the right partnerships. And at the same time, for the athletes, it's very important to create their own brand and create that exposure, because that's what the league wants. That's what the sponsors, potential sponsors want. And at this point, everything is measurable. And I think that's the critical component, because, back in the day, it used to be like, okay, we'll pick an athlete and we can do a few campaigns, but there wasn't the full understanding of how many people they can reach, or what does that do for the brand, or on the athlete side, what does that do for my personal brand? And this is where we come in, where we have basically developed a strategy, and we're really trying to use the data, but then also AI technology to understand, okay, this is an athlete that already has immense reach. But looking at the trends and looking at the data, we can now forecast with AI that is very likely exponentially increasing over the next few years. And we can make brands aware of that. We can make the athlete aware of that, so he can negotiate higher sponsorship deals. And that's really where we came in, and we developed a service that most of the large agencies are not offering.
Yeah. Gosh, Nico, I'm chomping at the bit. I want to ask you like 8 questions simultaneously, which is obviously not possible. So we're going to get there. And I'm going to break it down, because 3 arenas, which I know I want to explore with you, is you said the word exposure quite a few times. And I think it's important to talk about exposure and why the mere facet of exposure yields value. It yields value. Obviously, the athletes are generating exposure. Companies that sponsor them want that exposure. So I definitely want to talk about exposure and what's in it for these companies. Basically, where's that value being created? And then just for you listeners, I'm sure all of us are chomping at the bit to hear Nico's understanding and brilliance surrounding why are some athletes more of a brand than others? Because I think the Roger Federer example is perfect. We're definitely going to talk tennis, but I also know that you've got some golf examples for us. One of your clients, for example, you've got an awesome case study that he's sponsored by Adidas, Callaway, Porsche, all these different brands. So let's start with the exposure piece of it, because there are all these moving pieces. What's the value of exposure, Nico? How do we measure it in a world where you're right? AI and so much data helps us to measure it, but what is that value of exposure?
Yeah, great question. I think from the brand side, there's the exposure to certain audiences that they probably are looking for. That audience is aligned with the people that they want to reach as a brand, and they can analyze that now. We can help them analyze that and pick out the right athletes that have a following within that audience, within that group. So it's interesting for them to understand, okay, I have an athlete here that has a very strong following, fans, that are super engaged. And I can reach these fans now through the sponsorship. I can reach them directly. I can engage them. So I think that in itself is extremely valuable. And then for the athlete, I think it's critical to create that exposure and create a brand that appeals to a certain audience. And it's super important that is authentic and it aligns with their own values. That's something that we're very passionate about because, with all the media surrounding athletes these days, oftentimes we come across athletes that are just, they're not sure, they want to do certain things on social media because they feel like, okay, it's going to, create a larger audience for me. But it always has to be authentic. It always has to be aligned with their own values. I think the reach in itself is so important because once an athlete creates a brand and has that reach, it becomes appealing for brands. The brands will be able to see, okay, this athlete is has a very specific audience that we're trying to reach, and that makes it worth a sponsorship. We got really lucky, and in the beginning we signed in our first year Xander Schauffele, the number 6 or 7 back then, and he is still sponsored by brands like Highland, Callaway, Adidas, and we were looking into his brand and his brand positioning. Right, that's how we start. And you've probably seen this, Brian, when analyzing brands. You have a USP, a unique selling point, and a certain audience. And based on that, you create a brand. You create a brand positioning statement. You create a logo, a visual identity, and you create a content strategy that's based on those values that align with both the athlete and the brand. And I think that's where the key is for not just creating exposure, but creating exposure to the right audience.
Yeah, really well said. And I think this is very enjoyable for all of us because sports obviously goes into every facet of our lives here in the United States as well as globally. That's why I've always argued, I don't know what your take on this would be, Nico, but I would argue that, we've got all these politicians. People always say the American president is the most powerful person in the world. But my biggest argument is that the most famous person in the world is Cristiano Ronaldo. And whether you measure it from social media, whether you measure it from global notoriety and recognition, like we all know him. Why? It's because he's the best in the world at kicking a ball a certain way. And so I think that sports really permeates across cultures, across societies. It's the one thing that unifies, even if you don't speak the same language. You and I were joking around about a small German club before we hit record here that we both know of. And it's things like that bring people together. together. So I want to talk about the brand behind it, because a lot of people will be hearing you talk about this, Nico, and be like, okay, so what does it mean? Building a brand is being as polite and well-spoken as Roger Federer? Well, obviously not necessarily, because Cristiano Ronaldo has a different brand. Sometimes he's infamous. Every time he's famous. There's a lot of aspects to what a professional athlete's brand is. We see in American basketball, Charles Barkley has built an amazing brand. He's everywhere in the world of the NBA on TV, and he's retired, but he's funny, he's engaging. Shaq has gone into DJing, so many different business ventures. Nico, what are all of these surrounding elements of an athlete's brand that go way beyond just the field that they play on?
Okay, I have to start by saying that, of course, you picked the right example with Cristiano Ronaldo. I'm in Portugal at the moment, and to all the Argentinians out there, Messi is great too as well. but no, I think what they all have in common, Charles Barkley, Cristiano Ronaldo, Shaq, is that they are extremely authentic. They're not trying to be super careful with what they say, and it comes across as genuine and authentic. And I think that's a critical part in it. So what we typically do, and I think that's true for everyone, even if you're an entrepreneur or a CEO and you want to create a brand for yourself, there is an exercise that you can go through to really understand, like, what are my values, right? What are the deep values that I want to stand for? And what are areas that I can cover that are aligned with my interests? And I think that's a very important exercise at first, to understand where you are as a brand, and then ask yourself, what is my brand positioning statement? What makes me unique? And once, we do this with athletes all the time, right? Like we really go deep. We talk about, of course, the brand positioning, the values they have, what they want to stand for, and then we go into the trenches about the colors they like, and anything you can imagine becomes part of their brand. And that's when you create something that's authentic, that people can relate to. And typically that's, you can get a lot more engagement that way.
Yeah, Nico, I feel like right here we have to address something, because I love the fact that you're painting or drawing that bridge for us of what we're talking about with regards to athletes is also true of entrepreneurs, is also true of CEOs. And with that in mind, for every single listener who's sitting here saying, well, Nico and Brian, you guys want me to be a brand like Roger Federer? Like, he's the best tennis player to ever walk the planet. Maybe number 2, Novak Djokovic is for sure in the argument now. But obviously a lot of people are going to say, well, Roger Federer, he's good looking, he's well spoken, he's unbelievable at his craft. How am I going to start a brand? And Nico, what I'd really love to hear your perspective on is, I want to talk about the chicken or the egg problem, because a lot of people, it's easy to look at personal brands, whether it's an athlete or a business person, and think that the brand preceded the person choosing to become a brand. Whereas actually it's the opposite. How many of us, everyone's going to quickly realize who I support. David Beckham, when he was a youngster at Manchester United, he made the choice to become a brand, and then he became a brand. It's that level of intentionality. Nico, talk to us about that, because I'm sure in any stage of an athlete's career, just like any stage of an entrepreneur's or CEO's career, they have to make that choice to become the personal brand. What does that look like? Because I would argue that it happens before they've reached that level of fame. That is what actually brings that level of fame, is making that choice. Talk to us about the intentionality behind starting that personal brand.
100%. I think intentionality is so important for anyone, whether you're a CEO, whether you're an entrepreneur or an athlete. You need to be clear about that you have a personal brand, whether you like it or not. You have a voice, and I think it's extremely important also for athletes. Sometimes we come across athletes that haven't really thought about it too much, because they just want to focus on their game, and that's understandable, and sometimes that's what makes them great in the beginning. But I 100% agree that this intentional brand comes first, and knowing who you are. And in some cases, it takes some work to really figure out like what are the things that you feel comfortable with sharing with your audience, and what is it that you want to stand for. But I think many of the great brands that we're talking about, including David Beckham, they had a clear intention. They knew they already have a personality that they can turn into a brand, and then of course it takes the work to create the content strategy, and to be super intentional in what they want to share with their fans and overall audiences.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought up the word content, because obviously in marketing, we have a phrase, content is king. And Nico, whether they are an entrepreneurial brand, an athlete's brand, so many of us really hesitate when it comes to that content, because it's easy to get lost in a world of content. And all these great examples that we're listing here today, they know how to stand out. When David Beckham or Cristiano Ronaldo make a post on Instagram, it gets seen, and we could point to any great marketable athlete and show that that's their brand in play there. Nico, I want to talk about that, because I think about some of the so-called quieter personal brands. Like, let's pick on Wayne Rooney, for example. Gosh, what's an American example? Clearly soccer is my number one sport, but let's roll with Wayne Rooney, who might be a little bit of a quieter public figure, but his team that creates and manages his personal brand, they know how to amplify his true personality traits in his content. What sort of content are we talking about? Because telling a story, using our values, all these things you've introduced us here today, how do we get those to actually show up in our content?
I think the one thing that I like to say about athletes and in general is people want to get to know the person behind the player. And they want to get to know the person behind the CEO, behind the entrepreneur. So it can't just be about, the area of sports or business. It has to go deeper than that. And I think this is where all of us have to ask ourselves, okay, what are the things that we really are passionate about? What do we want to stand for? And that's, to me, when the shaping of a brand starts, understanding exactly these areas of content that are aligned with these values. So, that can include anything. It can include certain charities that they want to support. We have, one of our athletes is very passionate about autism, because his sister has autism. So he really wants to create a voice in that area. But then there's, personal things that they enjoy outside of sports that gives fans, basically a look behind the curtain. And I think that's very important, because we all want to connect on a human level, right? And we don't just want to look at the CEO as, being the business leader. We want to look behind the curtain. And it's the same for athletes. We try to encourage our athletes to, dive a little deeper. Like, okay, this might be new for you, but if you really want to connect with your fans and you want to have this tribe, then you have to go a little deeper. And, I'm using the word tribe because there's, you're familiar with it, and probably some of the audience as well. I think, a lot of athletes and public figures, they have a tribe, and sometimes that tribe is not big, but that tribe can amplify the message. And as an athlete or a public figure, you got to think about those elements. Like, this is the audience. What can I offer them? How can I connect with them? And I think that's a very important step.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you painted that picture for us, Nico, because when I think about, I'm trying to give some American examples, and I think about LeBron James, who obviously is the most famous NBA player currently, him and Michael Jordan for sure. And so when I think about LeBron, the pieces of content that really go viral from him, it's him screaming Taco Tuesday when he's sitting at the dinner table with his family, or showing him as a dad. Everybody knows LeBron's kids because it's a facet of his life that he loves to show. Hate him or love him. I'm from Boston, I've got respect for LeBron James because I feel like we see the human side of him. So yeah, even if it's just him rapping the lyrics and getting all the words wrong while he's on the way to training, those are things that we as fans love to see from these athletes. I want to transition and talk a little bit about AI because Nico, I feel like that's part of what makes your approach at Numinal a little bit different. Is it sounds like you're at the cutting edge of not only understanding the strategic business stuff, but also the coming of tools that are going to revolutionize the sports industry and obviously all industries. We talk about it a lot here on the show. Talk to us about the role of AI and how that assists in building these players' brands, dictating the content, helping to maximize the sponsorship and partnership opportunities. I'd love to hear what you've got up your sleeves there.
Yeah, AI has been extremely interesting for us. And I think, the number one use case I can give you is in most cases, we create data models for the athletes we work with, but then also the competitors, right? And those data models allow us to understand what the market value and the marketability of these athletes is. And then we can also look into, okay, what are certain pieces of content these athletes, for example, in golf, are sharing that are creating exponential exposure. So I can then advise my client if I'm seeing something that is extraordinary and has exponential reach and engagement, then by creating these data models and identifying that right away, I can then advise my clients and say like, hey, listen, this is an example of one of your competitors who has shared this, let's say, very emotional story. And it has gotten thousands of views, extreme engagement. We should think about a similar strategy. So the data itself is very interesting with AI, creating these data models and also forecasting, right? Like we can do some forecasting on where we think, based on the trends that we had over the past few years, where we think certain athletes will end up as far as their exposure and reach and following. And that is in itself very interesting for the brands we work with, because more and more brands are coming to us asking us like, well, how does this work? How can we identify the right player that we can sponsor? We don't want to just guess like it used to be. We want to have the data behind it. And that's where we can come in and say, all right, based on the trends we're seeing, based on what our AI models are telling us, this would be a great athlete. Number one, it's an athlete that has an audience and following that is relevant to your brand. Number two, these fans are hyper engaged. And number three, we see a trend that, his Google searches, his meltwater media mentions, his Nielsen exposure is all increasing. So, that's where our service comes in, and it becomes really interesting for athletes and brands to understand that.
Yeah, Nico, I think it's so fascinating hearing you talk so comfortably about both sides of the equation. Obviously, you've had a lot of professional experience on both sides of that, on the athlete side, but also you've previously worked within specifically developing sponsorship strategies across these brands. And I think it's fascinating how much of it is just you have a really innate ability to talk about the measurements that both sides are interested in. And I think the fact that you keep bringing data up, most people probably don't realize how deep this data goes. I think it's fascinating. One thing I learned as I was digging into your work is the marketability rankings for each players within golf, which obviously first asks the question of what is marketability? How do we measure marketability? You just talked about press mentions, obviously social media followings, all of these, but from a brand's perspective, what is it that they're looking for? Because athletes can be all different. They all come in all different shapes and sizes and flavors. Some of them are funny and charismatic. Some of them are more reserved. Some of them are more family people. Some of them have lavish hobbies where they spend money like nobody has ever seen in Dubai in the off season. Talk to us about that marketability that brands are looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there's two parts to it. There's one, how you can measure the marketability, right? And there are certain factors to it. And then typically what we do is So I'll start with the leagues, because for the leagues, it's interesting too. So the PGA, they started this program called the Player Impact Program, where they measure marketability, and they have certain metrics. So the metrics are Google searches, meltwater mentions, Nielsen exposure, Nielsen brand index, and then another metric called Mark score that measures the familiarity of a face to a general audience. And so of course, optimizing those metrics is great, and we do that for our players, because also the PGA pays them a lot of money at the end of the season if they rank high. But beyond that, so that is of course great. But then beyond that, you have the brands that are interested in that, and for the brands, it often becomes more customized, where we then look into, okay, what is it exactly that you're trying to accomplish, right? We have this conversation with the brands where we say, we can do an analysis, but you need to tell us exactly what is your intention, what are the KPIs. And let's say some brands might say, okay, we want to appeal to a female audience within a certain age range, and we know they have a certain household income, et cetera, and then we can, based on that, we can do our analysis. We can say, like, listen, there's a pool of athletes that are perfect for that, because they have exactly that following and that reach and engagement. And that's how we bring them together. So I think there's the more general exposure-based measurement that some of the leagues are going after, by the way. So the PGA is doing it, and that's a trend. I think the ATP, there are discussions, the ATP in tennis might take it over as well. And I think that there will be other leagues adopting this as well. But yeah, there's the general approach that's great for the leagues, and then there's the approach, of course, that's really important for the athletes, where we consult our athletes to let them know, listen, those are areas we can work on, because that will allow you to land a much higher sponsorship deal. And then you have the brands that are looking for very specific metrics.
Yeah, I think there's so many interesting parts of even just that glimpse into the world that you just shared with us, because part of it is what I really hear, Nico, as an entrepreneur myself, is obviously I love that you took that question. You said, well, it's about asking the brands, what are your goals? Let's start from their goals, not necessarily ours. And then the second thing that I really hear is having your finger on the pulse of identifying. Obviously, we see a shift. You bring up the ATP, for example, the ATP and WTA, the men and women's tennis associations right now, figuring out how to get more world-class tennis players getting at least a livable salary. Once you go outside the top 100, a lot of those players aren't making a livable salary. So having your finger on the pulse of those industries and understanding not only where they are today, but where they're going leads you so much strategic insight. So I really like that. And then the third thing that I hear from you, Nico, that I think really separates you and gives you such a strong vantage point is your ability to identify patterns. You can see, more and more brands are looking for the women athlete, obviously, as women's sports continue to grow, or more and more people are looking to have their brands perceived in this way. It's really powerful for you to identify those trends. So lots of good stuff that you've shared with us here today, Nico. I don't want to let you go just yet. I want to squeeze some more brilliance out of you. My last question to guests is always the hard one for you, which is so many of these different things that we talked about here today is directly relevant not only to athletes in sports, but to all of us as business owners, as leaders, as CEOs of our own businesses. Nico, you are a fellow entrepreneur just like all of us. So with all of that in mind, what's your big takeaway? What's the one thing that you hope our conversation today really sheds some light on and makes people go, holy cow, I can steal that from the sports industry. I can treat myself like a professional athlete's personal brand. What's that takeaway that you hope everyone walks away from here today?
Yeah, I think I have two takeaways. One is certainly about the brand, and I think it's so important to create a brand for yourself in any industry, any business, where you can speak to certain trends and certain also have a passion that you can communicate. Once you do that, I think you will attract a lot of like-minded people that want to partner with you. I think a lot of potential clients. Basically, you're putting yourself in a position where you are attracting, you putting yourself out there, and then you're attracting the right people that you ultimately want to work with. So I think being super intentional with your personal brand is critical. And I think there's a lot of exercises that you can go through where you just dive a little deeper into what you want to stand for, and think about yourself really as a brand, and ask yourself, what is my unique selling point? What is my brand positioning statement? What are the areas that I am passionate about, that I can speak to, that I want to speak to? And, what is the impact that I want to make? And once you nail down those questions, I'm sure there will be more, right? But I think it will give you a good starting point to, venture out and start speaking about these topics, positioning yourself. So that's one thing. And then I would say the second thing that I would love to just share, because my personal journey is that I think, once you discover these trends, and if you are in a corporate setting like I used to be, I think it's really important to follow that, because in most of the corporate settings, to be very honest, you won't have much freedom and creativity. So I say that because it took my business partner, to really push me over the line to do what we do, and it was the best thing that happened to me. So I think once you have identified that niche or that idea, I think it's just taking the leap and just going for it.
Yes, really profound and powerful advice from you there, Nico, for every single entrepreneur. Heck, even those of you who are tuning in today and you're still in the entrepreneurial phase, what Nico just shared with us is going to accelerate your success. This is the work you hear when we use that acronym USP in business. I think we often underestimate the power of the U there, unique. This is the only stuff that makes all of us unique from all the other options that consumers have out there. So, Nico, I love how much you stress that. And it really comes from that place of looking inward and figuring out who are we and what do we stand for. So every athlete needs to do that if they want to improve their marketability. Every business owner needs to do that if we want to stand out in a very crowded marketplace. So with all of that said, Nico, I so deeply respect all the work that you do. I'm going to personally tease a few of the resources that you all offer. I absolutely love this. You just published an ebook called The Ultimate AI Playbook for Athletes that is downloadable, which we're going to put in the show notes, and I want to hear your inside story on all of those things as well. You also have a free consultation on AI marketing and branding to athletes and brands. There's already professional athletes in the soccer world. Obviously, that's where my background is, that I'm excited to introduce to you, Nico. But tell listeners, because I know that from this conversation, they're going to be so eager to go deeper into your work. Where can they learn more about you, the awesome work you're doing with Numinal, and all that good stuff?
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for mentioning those. So definitely go to our website. That's numinalagency.com. And then you can find me on Twitter at reframe_Nick, NIC. That's on Twitter. And you can also find us on Instagram under Numinal Agency. And yeah, we can probably put the links to the AI playbook in the show notes, where it's basically like a playbook that I think is very relevant to athletes, but potentially also to everyone listening here, that speaks a little bit about how AI can be used to create a brand, to develop certain content, to amplify certain content, to optimize advertising, etc. And yeah, and then of course, we offer these free consultations for athletes and sports brands.
Yes, for sure. I love that overview. I'm gonna say it very clearly for listeners because there's so much good stuff on Nico's business website, which is at numinalagency.com. Obviously, scroll down below. We are linking to that ebook that Nico just talked to us about. We're linking to his business website, his personal LinkedIn, which is where you can connect and thank him for this episode, as well as reach out to him with any questions or any connections that you want to help him make, because obviously he's doing big work in the world of sports. And I just want to call that out on his website. You're going to see so many clear examples of the messaging that Nico and Numinal use because they know the value add. I think so much of what we talked about today is really bridging that gap of value. There's value in all these different places, and it's about bringing it together so that it serves all sides of it. That's why I don't always say win-win. I always say win-win-win, because in this case, Nico, your business grows, the athlete's business and personal brand grows, the sponsors' businesses grow, and heck, let's make it a fourth win. The fans get what they want when we have this level of authenticity from athletes. So it's wins all around. Numinalagency.com. Check the show notes for all the other goodies that we talked about here today. Otherwise, Nico, thank you so much. This was a ton of fun. Thanks for sharing all of your knowledge with us here today on the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast.
Thank you, Brian. This was a blast. Thanks.